Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, there was a big dust-up between Washington and Poland over supplying some warplanes to Ukraine. Talk about how we've seen a united front in NATO and in the West against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but this seemed to be an area where there was a little bit of a difference that might be critical.
Absolutely. So you bring up a good point. Up until sort of this little scuffle occurred, the U.S. and their NATO allies have really been very aligned. They've been almost in lockstep with their allies in figuring out what they want to do, what they don't want to do. And one of the big things that they've done, both in the 2 weeks since the invasion started and even predating that, is that they put a lot of resources in providing Ukraine's military with various types of weapons and machines, all in an effort to hold off Russian forces. Mm-hmm. And so one of the recent dust-ups that you mentioned was Poland announced publicly a decision that they would give up essentially their entire fleet of a specific fighter jet to Ukraine. And the plan, as they announced it, was that as they give these up, the U.S. would sort of backfill and provide U.S.-made jets to Poland to sort of fill in the gap that was left by Poland giving these jets to Ukraine. Now, the only problem with that is, according to the Pentagon, they don't want these jets, which were supposed to go from essentially Poland to Germany, and then from a U.S. military base in Germany to Ukraine. The Pentagon is worried that having these planes fly from a U.S. airbase in Europe to go into Ukraine could be seen as an act of war in Russia's eyes. Mm-hmm. And so we know that the Pentagon has gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid this type of escalation, or this type of, apparent escalation, or even anything that the Russians could use to say that it is an escalation, not even whether or not it is, just giving them the ammunition to use the fodder.
Mm-hmm. And given they're a nuclear-armed country,
exactly,
given that they're in progress, an invasion of Ukraine.
Exactly, and so the Pentagon has gone in various different ways above and beyond to try and prevent this type of thing from happening, and they see this as another way for, the interpretation of an escalation or the U.S. involvement in this war. And the U.S. has gone, very far in their efforts to avoid getting, directly involved in this conflict. So has NATO, and so the U.S. and the Pentagon have really come out against this plan. And one thing that Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby said in making this announcement was that they're not sure that this is even the best allocation of resources for the Ukrainian military. Mm-hmm. Now they may be saying that because they are very concerned about the possibility of this apparent escalation, or how Russia could view it, especially because we've seen Russia isn't necessarily acting in good faith in a lot of these avenues. And so it really is their concern is how it could be interpreted or spun by Vladimir Putin or people in the Kremlin.
Because the Biden administration is really trying to walk the careful line of fortifying Ukrainian defenses against the Russian invasion without getting NATO sucked into the war itself.
Exactly, and that's a stance we've also seen through the no-fly zone, or the request for a no-fly zone. We've seen Ukrainian President Zelensky ask repeatedly for the U.S. and NATO to implement a no-fly zone, and they've been very hesitant and downright refuse to do so because of what comes with a no-fly zone. And while it sounds good in theory for the U.S. or NATO to establish a no-fly zone over Ukrainian airspace, the real problem comes in if Russia actually tries to defy it. Mm-hmm. Because if that happens, then the U.S. or NATO is obligated to shoot down a Russian plane, for example. Mm-hmm. And talk about escalation or bringing someone into a war, there's nothing quite like bringing the U.S. into war than shooting down a Russian plane.
Right.
And so to date, we've seen the U.S., President Biden, and NATO come out very forcefully against this idea of a no-fly zone, even though we've seen people push for limited no-fly zones, or no-fly zones specifically over humanitarian corridors, which are essentially evacuation routes for civilians.
Right.
And so again, this is all an effort in keeping this conflict in this area, not letting it expand to other countries.
So there was a lot of talk about biolabs in Ukraine. They feature prominently in Russian propaganda about what Ukraine and NATO might do. but also a lot of concern on the U.S. side about possible chemical weapons attacks inside of Ukraine perpetrated by the Russians. What's sort of the facts and fiction here? What are we talking about?
So this is a new development in this ongoing war that we've seen for 2 weeks now. But in recent days, we've seen U.S. officials warn that Russia could use the claims of the U.S. being involved in, bio research facilities in Ukraine, and they've used it as propaganda to suggest the U.S. is, doing underhanded things, helping Ukrainians, and all of this is done as a deflection. Mm-hmm. We've seen the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department come out in recent days in a very alarmed fashion, talking about how this isn't what's actually going on in these facilities. The U.S. is there to help sort of decommission them. They've been there since 2000. The U.S. has worked with them for almost 2 decades, since 2005, on this project of sort of waning these down. And a big part of it that the White House warns is it's sort of in the Russian playbook of how they operate to accuse their enemy of something that they're about to do. Mm-hmm. And so the U.S. and the White House has been very apparent in saying, they're accusing us of this. We better be prepared and pay attention, because in the past when they've done something like this, it's because they're about to do it. Mm-hmm. And so everyone's sort of on high alert now, given the possibility of a potential chemical attack.
Where does the Russian invasion stand? I mean, obviously there's been some strong Ukrainian pushback, but also there are a lot of Russian troops in Ukraine, and there have been a lot of missiles fired.
Yeah, so it's important to know that even though Ukrainian forces have done, a better than expected job of holding off Russian forces, they're still significantly outnumbered and outgunned. Mm-hmm. Now that they have done very well in the north, particularly as it relates to Kyiv, the capital city, in holding off troops from getting to the capital city and essentially overthrowing the government.
Right.
That being said, Russia has had some more success in the southern part of the country, and that's in part due to the fact that they've been in Crimea for 8 years now, mm-hmm. And it's a shorter distance in supply routes. Mm-hmm. And so, in part due to the infrastructure, and in part due to it being easier to resupply the troops, they've had greater success in the south. They've captured a couple cities in the south along the Black Sea, mm-hmm. And so they've had a little bit more success. But at the same time, there is a concern that as this drags on, Putin might get desperate enough to, go scorched earth or go even further in pushing the envelope. Mm-hmm. Partially, we've seen due to these threats of an apparent chemical attack. Now, we've also seen civilians, whether that's, people, hospitals, we've seen, residential areas all get hit with rockets. The Pentagon said as recently as the other day that there have been more than 700 rocket attacks mm-hmm. heading towards Ukraine, either from within the country, Belarus, or from Russia. And all of these, we've seen some lasting images that have come out. We're hearing reports of 500 civilians who have been killed, and yet we all know that a lot of these numbers in the fog of war generally go up as it relates to civilian casualties, and we know that it's really hard to get verified information on these statistics. However, the UN does a good job in updating them, and we've also seen from the UN that there are already more than 2 million people who have left the country, who have fled, and this is only in the 2 weeks since the invasion began.
And so, even acknowledging that in the fog of war there's some uncertainty about the numbers, we believe, at least, the U.S. government believes, that there have been some fairly high casualties among the Russian troops as well.
Yeah, so we heard earlier this week in testimony on the Hill that the U.S. intelligence community believes that there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 to 4,000 Russian troops who have lost their lives already. Mm-hmm. Now, the Ukrainian forces say that number is as high as 12,000. Right. So obviously there's a big difference in what these two sides are reporting. And both sides in a given conflict, whether that's Ukraine or Russia, in this particular instance, have their own, benefits of fudging the numbers one way or the other. Sure. So it is hard to ascertain exactly what the real answer is, but we do know that, at least from the U.S. perspective, that number is generally in the ballpark of 2,000 to 4,000.
So, the higher end of that range gets you into sort of Iraq war territory after only 2 weeks.
Yeah, and so one thing to also remember is that the U.S. has said that Russia amassed around 170,000 troops at the border, and that's both in Russia as well as in Belarus, which borders Ukraine to the north. Essentially, all of that 170,000. Now, that number can also fluctuates a little bit. The Pentagon isn't, have a specific number, but all of those troops essentially are in Ukraine now, and the Pentagon hasn't seen any update of President Putin taking more troops from, the interior and sending them closer to the border. So, at this stage, it looks like the entire fleet the entire battalion that was on the border is now inside Ukraine fighting, but at the same time, it doesn't look like they'll be getting significant reinforcements anytime soon.
A perilous moment for the world. Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at WashingtonExaminer.com.